We'll make a start. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining this, the launch of Wildlife and Countryside Link's 4th annual wildlife crime report, covering wildlife crimes recorded and reported in 2020. I'm delighted to be joined by our panel and by our guest of honour, Luke Pollard, MP, the Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. On the panel, we have Martin Sims from the League Against Cruel Sports, who is chair of the Link Wildlife Crime Group. We also have Dawn and Craig from the Badger Trust, Kate from Naturewatch Foundation, Mark from the RSPB, and Jenny from Plantlife International. I will shortly turn to Luke to kick off, but just before I do, in terms of running order, we will have Luke, the panel, and then questions. So whilst everyone is speaking, please do feel free to put your questions in the chat or Q&A. We will come to them at the end. I'll also shortly put a link to the report in the chat box. In terms of the background to this report, the Link Wildlife Crime Group is England's largest coalition of organisations working on wildlife crime. We've been producing these reports for 4 years with our friends at Wales Environment Link, and we do it to try and fill a bit of a data black hole in the sense that wildlife crimes are not recorded by the Home Office currently. So our organisations who work at the front line of wildlife crime have to do what they can to record them. So we don't claim that this is a full picture of wildlife crime in 2020. It is unfortunately probably the tip of the iceberg, and the panel will talk about that more shortly. But with that, thank you very much everyone for attending, and over to you, Luke.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Matt, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. I think we need to deal with wildlife crime on a much more serious basis than we are at the moment as a country, and that does mean starting to record wildlife crime properly, because if you value it, you record it and you measure it, and then you can have a plan against it. But I think more importantly, we need to recognise that wildlife crime is a threat to the ecological recovery of many of our habitats, because it is the tip of the iceberg of a type of behaviour that is leading to more habitats being put under threat, more species being lost. And we are in the middle of this climate and ecological emergency. And sometimes that is such a big crisis that it can seem hard to know what you can do. Because as the phrase goes, and I encourage you not to do this, how do you eat an elephant? As the phrase goes, and the answer is one mouthful at a time. Now, as I'm responsible for animal welfare in the Labour Party, can I encourage you not to be eating elephants? But the idea of bite-sizing problems, I think, is a strong one. And when we look at the climate crisis, all too frequently, I think we focus on carbon alone. But if we don't solve the climate and the ecological crisis together, we will solve neither of them. And that's really why, when we're talking about the ecological crisis, it's not just about habitat restoration. It's not just about tree planting. It's not just about preventing the preventable extinction of species at home and abroad. It's about looking at the behaviours that are leading to those challenges and that are making the recovery harder. And I think when we're looking at wildlife crime in particular in the UK, we need to be looking at what can be done to protect certain habitats, certain species, looking at the behaviours of some practices, both agricultural but also criminal, that are contributing to it. And from my point of view, the work that that you're doing to record, to get a sense of direction. And I think, Matt, your caveat about whether every single crime is being recorded or not, I think is a useful one, but the direction of travel of this, I think, is really important. And there's no doubt that the pandemic has affected how we see and how we record crime. It's affected how people report it. But the pandemic has also changed, I think, our connection with nature as a society. And I think for all of those who have an affinity towards our natural world, towards wildlife, this should be an encouragement to go faster and to go further, because more people care about their surroundings because they've had more time to be exposed to them. I think when we were on our compulsory hours worth of exercise and no more during one of the lockdowns, you found yourself probably saying, isn't it great you can hear the birds sing more? And that small sentiment is a bit like an acorn that has grown in so many people to now have a bigger sense of what is the involvement with the natural world that they can have. And so I'm very keen on looking not only at how we can build in a right to nature, but that right to nature being one that's built into our education system. So young people by the age of 10, I think, should have been to the seaside and should have been to the countryside. To do that, they would have had the awareness and exposure to wildlife and to species that they may not ordinarily have had. I think this creates more rounded individuals, better able to function and to explore, to fulfill the opportunities ahead of them. But what it will also do, I think, is build a greater and even greater affinity with our natural world. Now, that does mean that when we're looking at wildlife crime, when we're looking at the behaviors that are threatening many of our species, threatening nature recovery, importantly, we need to get the data right. We need to understand what the extent of the problem is, and then what are the obstacles for tackling that problem. And there's certainly the case that when you look into the figures, there's an underreporting, I think, because that also reflects an undervaluing of the animals, of the birds, of the habitats that are being threatened by criminal behavior and irresponsible behavior. And I think the more that this is exposed, the more that we tell the stories about what is happening, I think the greater chance we have of keeping this on the political agenda, ensuring that politicians from the left, like me, but from the right, as we have in government now, are sharing that passion, say, there's something we need to do here. Our constituents want us to go further. And believe me, the amount of emails that I've had about animal welfare in the last year has got bigger and bigger. The amount of emails I've had about poo in rivers has also been quite significant recently as well. But that, I think, speaks to this greater connection. And I think what I'd like to see out of this type of effort is not only a requirement of saying, look, things are changing. We know that wildlife crime is getting worse in many cases, and we can also then hopefully use some of the figures that you're preparing, Matt, to drill down into what's the regional basis. What's it like in your locality? Because I don't think it's enough just to give for want of a better phrase, a global figure on wildlife crime. We need to personalize it. We need to tell the story so each and every community can understand what species, what practices, and what they can do about it. And the first step needs to be properly recording. The second step needs to be properly resourcing. So we can have wildlife crime properly recorded, properly then investigated, and then valued, because we know that there are specialists in our police force and in local authorities that are working on this. We know there's not enough of them. And we do know that the public supports this. So this is not an area where we should be banging our head against the wall in frustration. This should be an area where we should continue to work together to have steps in the right direction. And as we've seen today with news from the National Trust about them banning trail hunting on their own land, I think it shows that public pressure, sustained pressure, campaigns that speak in plain English, use examples that people can understand, can be extraordinarily powerful. And I want to encourage you to keep going in that regard, to keep making the case for change. But on this one here, when we're looking at wildlife crime, let's not only tell the story about figures, let's tell the story about the impacts that someone that's not connected with this space can take on board and go, this is not right. Because we are in a climate and ecological emergency. We do need to decarbonize, but we need to protect our environment. And protecting our environment does not mean keeping it in aspic. It means having healthy, vibrant ecosystems, having a natural world that is something that we can value, we can enjoy, we can benefit from, but we can also see the advantages for species and habitats at the same time. So extraordinary opportunity we have in the coming years, I think, to put this further up the political agenda. And the work that you've been doing, individual organizations, individuals, has been incredible. And can I encourage you to carry on with that, to keep going, because the window of opportunity has opened for us here. I think for all of those that want to see faster and further action, I think we have seen encouragement in legal cases, encouragement in prosecutions, encouragement in data, in terms of saying that there's things that we can do. So please keep at it, keep going. And the more that we get there, the more politicians like myself and all political parties will become converts to the cause and will be putting pressure on government to do the right thing, record crime properly, resource it properly, and then take action properly. And that will lead us to a better future where more of our habitats and species are safe. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Luke. And I think it's a very important reminder about the role wildlife crime plays in the wider nature recovery ecosystem. So with that, I will hand over to Martin Sims, who chairs our wildlife crime group and is from the League Against Cruel Sports, to talk about the hunting with dogs part of the report. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Matt. If you can get the PowerPoint up, thank you. I'm not seeing it, Matt.
Can you not see that?
Just the link branded PowerPoint template is all I'm seeing.
Bear with me one tick. Sorry about this, everyone.
It's just not animals and children to work with. It's PowerPoint as well, by the looks of it too.
Can you see this now? Can you see it
now?
Mate.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
great.
Fine. So if you can go on to the next slide, Matt. Thank you. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Martin Sims, chair of the Wildlife Crime Working Group within the Link, and also Director of Investigations within the League Against Cruel Sports. And this afternoon, within the chapter, I'm going to talk about the 5 themes, which is specific species of quarry that we say are still impacted on, the rise in reported cases yet decline in prosecutions, the issue that came out of the Mark Hankinson trial on the 15th of October, and that trail hunting is a total smokescreen, the fact that hare coursing and actually deer coursing is becoming more of a trend, but hare coursing in particular is still rife, and why it needs tougher legislation for both hunting and coursing. Thanks, Matt. Okay, no surprise that the main species, because obviously former fox hunts, shall we say, chase the red fox. Red deer are still an issue with the 3 stag hunts down in the southwest. The brown hare through both beagle packs and coursing. The roe and fallow deer, which are obviously smaller species of deer than the red, are pursued by coursers, which is truly horrific. To see the footage of that is truly upsetting. Badgers, because of set blocking within hunting, badgers can die, and that is still rife. And the question is, why would you need to block badger sets if you're pursuing a trail? And then the mink, yes, it's an invasive non-native, but there's also the impact it has with the otters, with the hounds going down the river courses, because there's still 18 mink hunt packs still left in the UK. Next slide, Matt. Thank you. So where we're going to the rise in reported cases yet drop in prosecutions, we're seeing at least 5 cases a week where illegal hunting is known about and the evidence is there, which is normally from film footage, whether that's individual or groups of monitors or SAB groups. And yet in the report, it shows where prosecutions are decreasing significantly. And I think within that, the key factors are policing and the Crown Prosecution Service. From a policing perspective, it's officers not knowing what they are looking at in terms of the hunting or the riding style of those on horseback, to know actually what they're watching. So they don't understand, because there isn't specific training around it up until now, around what it is that the officers are looking at on film and how they relate that to the Hunting Act, because invariably no one's done that. I have, from my previous years in Surrey Police, used to actually ride on horseback looking after the hunt, pre-Hunting Act. So I've watched it go on for 12 seasons. So I can relate to what I see on the film footage to then what goes on. And that's something that really does need more training of the police officers. It was interesting what Luke said about the numbers of officers out there. There are some forces that have got enough officers to deal with the issues, but they haven't got the specific training and specialist knowledge in certain areas, where it sometimes falls down. So the force might have enough officers, but it's that training issue that sometimes falls down. Crown advocates at times as well, from a Crown Prosecution Service perspective, either have little time to prepare because they are given it at fairly short notice if it's an agent or potentially a barrister. And also, again, not knowing how to relate what they see on the film to the actual legislation itself, and that's where it falls down to. And as an example, I was looking at some data on Monday. In the last 4 weeks, there's cases where deer savaged by hounds in Dorset and the deer needed putting down, having been pursued and caught. 2 foxes killed in one hunt in Dorset, and then hounds seen trespassing in pursuit along a railway line in South Durham. Well, if it was a trail hunt, who the hell would be laying a trail on a railway line? Big prosecution straight away for trespassing. Thanks, Matt. Hare coursing still rife, and I thank Chief Inspector Phil Vickers from Lincolnshire Police for assisting with this particular slide, because he heads up Operation Galileo, which is part of the 28 police forces that now try and have a concerted effort around hare coursing because it's so rife. And as you can see, at least 15,000 incidents reported to police alone. Many go unreported, and part of that is because of call handlers within policing. When people phone in to say what they've got, they don't understand what it is sometimes they're relating to. So it could be, I want to report a man with dogs walking across a field. Well, how do they know that's actual coursing? Though the person reporting it might know, how do call handlers know if they have never had any exposure to what that's about, whether that's training or seeing it? Now, the government earlier this year committed to strengthening the legislation, which involved actually a DEFRA round table to look at the issues. And that was much earlier in the year. And those that actually contributed and actually chipped in were told, we'll be getting back to you to do one-to-one interviews with you to expand on the information you were providing. Well, several months later on, nothing's happened. There's been no contact from that particular group, which is disappointing. So it was great to give the commitment, and months later, we're still seeing nothing. Coursing fueled by gambling, and of course, because of the rich rewards of the gambling, it outweighs the sanction that they will get, which is invariably under the Game Act of 1831, normally, which means it's a fine. So there isn't a suitable enough deterrent in terms of the sanctions and the penalties they will get balanced against the rewards. And of course, the biggest issue around that is the seizure of dogs, because that is the tool of the trade. Albeit they, in most cases, they're a utility. They're there to do a job. So once they've actually finished their coursing career, so to speak, they get abandoned or discarded. And it needs the seizure, forfeiture and banning of keeping of these dogs would be the biggest deterrent for a courser. And because of the animal welfare issues linked to accepting it's not a kept animal, it's a wild animal. Though the argument is there that once a hare has been caught by the hound, however long it takes for its death, it's captive. And therefore, it does really need a life ban for people who do this for keeping dogs. So thanks, Matt. Clearly, the big issue around hunting this year has been the Mark Hankinson trial on the 15th of October as a result of the webinars that occurred last August, of which there were 8 presenters over the webinars talking about how to do trail hunting. I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek. And of course, on the 15th of October, Hankinson was convicted by Deputy Chief Magistrate Tan Inkram of inciting and encouraging others to commit Hunting Act offences, which was under the Serious Crimes Act. Yes, it's under the Serious Crimes Act, but the penalties are only those that would be for the normal crime that is trying to be encouraged or incited, which meant it was a fine only, as Hunting Act offences are summary only. It's really significant, some of the comments made by other presenters in the webinars, and it's interesting that Deputy Chief Magistrate Ikram did mention that obviously Hankinson did not condone some of the comments of the others, which suggests actually how many of the others should have been charged as well. And when I read some of the other comments, which included from 2 retired police officers, as a 31-year police officer myself, I was quite despondent to see what retired officers could say about the law and crime, which for me was hugely disappointing. I think it's a hugely significant case, and arguably it's the most significant issue since the Hunting Act came in, and clearly shows us a smokescreen for what is still going on as conventional hunting. And only yesterday, our investigators were out and were told a story about how trail laying was going on, and we disproved it as a complete farce. And this particular hunt in the east of England. And it's significant now that Natural Resources Wales and the Malvern Hills Trust have given the bans on hunting. And as I understand, it might be coming out today about what the National Trust are doing. And it's significant when you look at the Malvern Hills Trust Board, some of the evidence that came to light for their ban last week, that during monitoring of 10 hunts, trail laying was only ever observed on 1 occasion immediately prior or during the event. And that speaks volumes for what's been going on for all these years since the Hunting Act came in. Matt, next slide. And I think in terms of both coursing and illegal hunting, next step should be that exemptions need to be seriously streamlined, if not completely scrapped. If there is a Hunting Act still to remain, then the term reckless needs to be added to section 1. It can't just be about intentional. I think it's also about the recklessness, because this is one of the issues when you watch the hunts and the riding styles of the huntsmen and the whipper-ins. There's I've never seen them actually try and stop. It's always with a view that if there's a fox there, they encourage the hounds on. I think the Crown prosecutors need to be aware of the legislation and have enough time to prepare cases and fully understand the legislation. And to that end, I do commend Paul Stimpson as head of wildlife for the Crown Prosecution Service, because both the League and the Badger Trust will be delivering training to prosecutors nationally. That both includes lawyers, agents and barrister advocates during December and January of December of this year and January of next year. So there's a real positive step going forward. And the hare coursing legislation needs to be strengthened in order to deter coursers, particularly if it meant permanent loss of dogs. But we'll wait to hear from DEFRA what goes on with next steps since that roundtable early this year. And I think that's it from me, Matt.
Thank you very much, Martin. We will now go to Dawn Varley of the Badger Trust, and hopefully the sharing function will work better than it did before. Bear with me. Right, let's start there. Can people see, can panelists see the presentation?
Not yet, same as last time. We can see your Explorer at the minute.
Bear with me one tick. My apologies, we do seem to be having some issue with the screen sharing.
Shall I try and share from my end, Matt?
Yes, if I make you co-host, you should be able to do that.
Okay. Can you see my screen? Is that working?
Yep. Over
Great,
to you.
fantastic, great. Well, thank you everyone for taking time to attend today. And Luke, thank you for your opening comments, much appreciated for that, and to have you with us today. So yeah, I'm talking on badger persecution, the section within the report, particularly on badger persecution. And I'm speaking on behalf of Badger Trust, but the chapter was put together and the statistics and the background also with our colleagues at Naturewatch Foundation. And I think Kate is speaking later as well. So the headlines, unfortunately, it's been a very bad year for badgers in terms of badger crime. The big news is the figures are showing us a massive increase in reported badger crime. And has already been said, I think the key phrase is always going to be with this report and statistics across all flora and fauna, is that it's the tip of the iceberg. So we really don't know the extent, but what we know is what we're getting reported and what we're seeing is probably just a small proportion. But at least we do have this reporting. We are reporting on it. We're bringing more attention to it, so that's a good start. But when you think about the actual scale of the figures behind those that we have, it does become incredibly depressing. So what we've seen this year is a 36% increase on the figures, on the latest figures. So that's the figures for 2020, the complete year for 2020. Versus the 2019 figures, and a huge part of that in terms of badgers, which this section references, is set interference. So that's something that is specifically illegal under the Protection of Badgers Act. But that is a huge part of those figures. And of the set interference in particular, the biggest increase that we've seen is on the development side. So people, whether they're large scale like HS2, or whether it's a small scale project like a residential or a building of estate, so it's small, large, or relative. And just because I've named HS2, please don't think that I am naming them, but just talking about the scale of the projects and the extensiveness of development for housing, it is a real big problem in terms of criminal activity, knowingly or unknowingly, to the extent that we're seeing that now equal hunt reports. So as Martin just mentioned, there's an intrinsic link between badger persecution and hunting activity. And whilst hunting activity should have no impact on wildlife if it was being correctly handled under the Hunting Act with no persecution of wildlife, we know that's not the case. And again, as Martin referenced, trail hunting and the smoke screen that involves, we know that animals are still being persecuted. So badgers are a big part of that. Now, on paper, badgers are a protected species. They've got their own legislation with the Protection of Badgers Act. We've also got protection within other acts as well. So the Wildlife and Countryside Act, the Animal Welfare Act, and of course the Hunting Act, as just referenced there. But persecution remains rife, unfortunately, and hence the need for an organisation like ours, which is all about addressing that. So in terms of what has been driving crime in the latest statistics, we'll never exactly know, but these are our insights and our understandings. We think the pandemic obviously has a big effect on our lives, on nature, on wildlife, and on how we undertake our activities and live life amongst that has affected wildlife. And we think there's been a couple of lockdown effects. So the first lockdown effect, when it was a case of our exercise, everyone's at home, quite a scary situation, nobody move, that sort of allowed an empty countryside, and of course not all badger crimes happen in the countryside, but a lot are there, allowed a perfect environment for those who want to persecute badgers to get out there and go and do that with much reduced fear of being caught. So we think that led to an increase in badger persecution. Sort of on the flip side and related, and later down the line when lockdown was lifted, you were allowed to exercise more and go further. There was more people, way more people as we know, thankfully, and as Luke referenced before, taking joy in nature and getting out in the countryside in a way that they hadn't before. So there were more people with eyes on the countryside, paying more attention, and we hope, we really do hope, that our efforts and the efforts of our colleagues in other NGOs, including Naturewatch Foundation, to get a better understanding out to the public on what badger crime looks like, how to report it, those led also to the increase in reports. So more activity on the criminal side, but more eyes who are recognising those signs of activity. So there's sort of two lockdown effects there that we're seeing. As I mentioned previously, development. This is really coming to the fore in terms of the threat to badgers. So reports were up over 220%. That's massive on the previous year. And it's highlighting what we're calling and what we've heard other references a slow and creeping cull of badgers. This is one to watch out for, and it's serious, and it could push badgers to a real threatened place. And of course, talking about the cull, whilst the ongoing badger cull in England is of course not a crime, it's a government sanctioned activity as part of their BTB eradication programme. We have to be realistic, and the ongoing cull for the last 9 years, in the eyes of the public, it puts badgers in a bad place. They're viewed as diseased, as something to be scared of something not want to go near, and that sort of impacts the character and the reputation and sort of demonizes a protected species, and that has a real impact on what people think it's appropriate to do or not to do to badgers. So it has an impact on the overall picture, we feel, and we feel that's something it needs to be sort of named and put out there as well. The sort of moving from the horrible statistics to what is being done, a lot is being done, and we do hope that feeds into the increased reporting, and we want to see more reporting. You sort of don't want to see increased crime, but you do, because being reported, so you know that it is being recognised and reported, and then the police forces can see the impact of it and be able to dedicate more resources. So what's happening out there? What's the good news amongst this? So Badger Trust, we continue to deliver our dedicated badger crime training to police forces. We've now trained 41 out of the 43 forces in England and Wales, and we're on the second or third time round. So that's great, because the more expert eyes within forces, the more it can be recognised when it's happening and known what to do, and in a time frame which helps the likelihood of prosecution as well. Is it an active set? Is it not an active set? In 2019, ourselves, together with Naturewatch Foundation, produced the dedicated guide for investigators. That's been hugely successful, and it's helped enforcement and prosecution organisations to actually bring perpetrators to account and recognise the signs. In 2020, we also produced a Stop Badger Crime film aimed at the public to say, this is what badger crime looks like, here's the signs of it, here's what to recognise, here's how to record it, and here's how to report it. If you haven't watched that, you can find it on our website, and please share it. We've also got a reporting form on our website as well, and you can also report to Naturewatch. And in 2021, and I think Kate will talk about this again shortly, a new film was brought out from Naturewatch Foundation aimed at teenagers, educating on badger crime. And of course, as I just mentioned, we've got all the dedicated reporting options via key NGOs. And touching on a point that Martin mentioned as well, recognising reporting crime is one stage of it, then getting it to the police and having it recognised as a crime and then action being taken. But if that doesn't end in prosecution, if there is no result from it, if the perpetrators are seen to be getting away with it and it's not being taken seriously, then we still have a problem. We haven't moved down the road in trying to solve this problem. So working with the CPS to support prosecutors so that they know how to recognise crime, they know what they're looking for, they know what it means, they know what the relevant law is really important amongst it, and we're working on that as well to help make a change. And finally, the recommendations in terms of badger crime in the latest set of statistics. There's some common themes here amongst a few of the speakers, but recording. We really need offences being recorded correctly, consistently, so that we've got robust statistics and we can really analyse this and understand what's going on. As Luke said, if you value something, you measure it. Well, we should really be measuring this in a robust and consistent way. That then has the knock-on effect of police forces can see the scale of the problem, can look to dedicate resources. We're not kidding ourselves here that this is seen as the most important thing, but it is important. It has links to wider criminality, animal crime, animal abuse is linked to human abuse as well. There's a lot going on here, so it's not just something that can just be put to one side as not important. It's important and it needs resources. Again, thinking about the prosecutors side of it, we need specialist prosecutors. so we can avoid the risk of failed or non-existent prosecutions when actually there's a clear evidence of criminal activity. And we also need expert witnesses, sometimes called expert or competent, that's why I've got the quotes around there, to help secure those convictions. So quite a lot to do. But we know what needs doing, so that's the first step on the way. And again, thank you for taking the time to come and listen and support the launch of this report. And we look forward to working with you all going forward to make a difference on wildlife crime. Back to you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Dawn. We now turn to Kate Parker from Naturewatch Foundation to talk a little bit more about some of the work that Dawn mentioned. I am going to try and share screen again. I think I may have fixed it, but let us give it a go. Now, hopefully that will be better. Can people see the slides now? Yes, perfect. Over to you, Kate.
Brilliant, thanks, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for giving up your time to join us today. As Matt said, I'm Kate Parker, the Wildlife Crime Campaign Manager for Naturewatch Foundation. And as an organisation, we sit within the membership of partners of the Wildlife and Countryside Link. Dawn has kindly been through the badger persecution chapter of the report, so I'm going to briefly talk about the work of Naturewatch Foundation within wildlife crime. For those of you who may not be familiar with Naturewatch Foundation, we are an animal welfare charity with two main areas of work. So one is campaigning and lobbying on a variety of animal welfare issues, such as illegal dog breeding, the link between animal abuse and human violence, and most relevant today would be wildlife crime. The other area of our work is cyber investigations into, again, illegal dog breeding and those hunting wildlife with dogs. Next slide, Matt. Brilliant. So with more people spending most of their time at home throughout 2020 due to COVID-19, the use of social media as a communication tool increased also. This meant that cyber investigations were even more valuable when restrictions meant that some enforcement agencies were unable to continue their frontline investigations as they would have pre-COVID-19. You'll see on the slide a quote from one of our investigators who continued their work through 2020. Our wildlife crime investigations uncovered instances such as an individual involved in the illegal use of dogs below ground, providing his services as a terrierman for a registered hunt. So this then allowed him to access more land and provided frequent opportunities to see his dogs fight with wild mammals. His activities involved the illegal persecution of badgers, placing his dogs in situations where they are injured and inflicting mental and physical suffering to foxes during protracted dig-outs lasting many, many hours. Our cyber investigations team gathered evidence using various open source research techniques and presented the information to the necessary enforcement agencies to further action the investigations. Next slide. 2020 was another busy year for campaigning, so going back to that side of our work, and awareness projects. So with the publishing of a wildlife crime novel for teenagers, which was written on behalf of Naturewatch Foundation by the author Jeff Francis. This novel, in conjunction with the school's awareness video that Dawn has previously mentioned, meant that we were getting stuck into educating our younger generation to show kindness and compassion and to be able to recognise the signs of badger persecution in their local communities, which Luke obviously mentioned earlier in his speech in terms of educating the younger generation to then hopefully change the future. As with most things, COVID-19 put a slight spanner in the works for its continued implementation, and we hope that we can push forward through 2021 and into 2022 with the school's awareness programmes and educating our younger generation. Next slide. So looking forward to the future, Naturewatch Foundation now conducts cyber investigations to cover all named individuals hunting wildlife with dogs. This is an expansion from our previous focus on solely badger persecution. Our investigators more often than not saw a crossover whereby those inflicting such pain and suffering on badgers weren't species specific and often hunted other animals such as hare, deer, wild boar. So it seemed a logical expansion for our investigations team. As you will have seen in the annual report, members of the Wildlife and Countryside Link have agreed on priorities going forward. Naturewatch Foundation will be pushing its campaigns to finally get wildlife crimes recordable and see sentencing guidelines introduced, both of which have been pushed for the past few years by many organisations and are still as relevant and necessary in the fight against wildlife crime. As Luke mentioned earlier, a lack of recording shows a clear lack of value for our wildlife. So we're determined to keep pushing and determined to see this over the life chain. Thank you, everybody, for your time today.
Thank you very much, Kate. So we now turn to Mark Thomas from RSPB to talk through the raptor persecution chapter of the report. I should warn people that some of the figures in this are particularly distressing. But over to Mark to begin, and again, hopefully share screen will work. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for letting us speak at this event. Really, really good opportunity, the fourth year to do so. RSPB have been producing a bird crime report for decades, and obviously in the last 4 years, the figures from that have fed into Link. So the first thing is, what is raptor persecution? Well, raptors are the most amazing birds. So the birds typically you'll see in the countryside will be red kites, will be buzzards. If you live in Scotland, you might see eagles. And the persecution is basically the illegal killing, trapping and poisoning, which is on the next slide, please, Matt, of these birds.
Apologies, the slide issue has come up again, so I'll make you co-host. And then if you're right to deal with the slides that way, if that's okay.
It's not moving to the next slide, I'm afraid.
Yes, sorry, it's there's another slide issue, but I'm just going to start again with this one.
Okay, sorry. So anyway, birds of prey are amazing birds. You know, they're most spectacular animals, but sadly they are illegally killed. They're trapped, shot and poisoned, and RSPB has been working on that for many, many years. And is it going to work? Would you like me to just share from my computer? I've got, oh, here we go. Brilliant. Thank you. Next slide, please. Brilliant. Okay, so shooting, trapping and poisoning are the key things that impacts birds of prey. So we produced the bird crime report in October of this year, and that detailed all the confirmed offences from 2020. So a confirmed offence in terms of bird of prey persecution is where we have a 95% confidence that a crime has happened. So that's an extremely high level. It is higher than what the government do in policing. So we would typically expect around 60 to 70 confirmed incidents per year. Next slide, please. But the results of 2020 showed, here we go. The results of 2020 showed it was the worst year on record, and we had 137 incidents across the UK, of which 104 were in Wales and England. So that's an enormous increase on the previous years. And as a number of people have commented already, that is down to several things. One, the people who kill birds of prey, and let's make it clear from the start, 2/3 of the people convicted are gamekeepers on game estates. No, so driven grouse moors in particular, and also lowland shoots. So these people during 2020 were really emboldened to go out there and kill birds of prey. And we had numerous reports from people that live near the estates or during the 1 hour walk witnessed these types of crimes. So in one incident in North Yorkshire alone, which is the worst county in the UK, and that had 26 confirmed incidents, on one particular job there alone, 5 buzzards were seen being shot. The police went and recovered the birds. 8 gamekeepers were then arrested and interviewed, but no charges were brought. So that's just a typical example of the types of crimes. In Scotland, outside the reach of this link, but in Scotland, a satellite tag that had been tracking the movements of a golden eagle, the tag vanished, the eagle vanished mysteriously, and then a member of the public found that tag wrapped in lead, which would be to stop the transmissions of the tag, and it was dumped in a river. So, so you've got amazing iconic top predators like golden eagle being subject to this kind of persecution. When we look at the figures for England and Wales, 68 incidents, that is 2/3, are linked to land that was used for game bird shooting. So again, we know who is committing these crimes, we know where they're committing these crimes, we have the confidence from the conviction data and the confidence from the high level of the incidents that are coming in and the confirmation of those. We know what the problem is here, so there needs to be mechanisms that unlock the problem. And again, another very common theme through everybody here, this is the tip of the iceberg. So the population studies on birds of prey alone indicate these incidents are a fraction of what is really going on. And we get really good intelligence from a number of people who work on estates and give us the data. And they're saying, in some instances, individual estates are killing more birds than we have the total for the whole of the United Kingdom in a typical year. So It shows you the problems in detecting this crime because it's in remote locations at difficult times of day. And then secondly, even when you get the evidence, it's incredibly difficult to prosecute these cases. And there was only one prosecution during the window we're talking about here. Next slide, please, Matt. Okay, so one point of note, one of the most kind of totemic birds for this kind of persecution is the Hen Harrier. So there's enough habitat in England alone for 300 breeding pairs, yet we've got around about 25 breeding pairs. It's a bird which all the science and the data shows that if the illegal killing stopped, this bird would recover. So when we talk about recovery and what we need to do and what the steps are to recovery, if people stopped killing, shooting this bird would recover. However, in 2021, 84 young were fledged in England, and there is a brood management scheme taking place which RSPB does not support. What the scientific data shows from these birds from satellite tagging is many of the young that fledge from these nests will sadly in their lifetime encounter illegal persecution. Next slide, please, Matt. So let's look at some of the successes as well. One of the key things that happened in the year was a UN-led review of wildlife crime enforcement. And that was a key thing. RSPB, alongside many of the other link partners, were interviewed as part of that process. And we gave real insights into what we encountered day by day tackling raptor persecution. We know that report has been written. We know it's gone to government, and we await the findings from the government in terms of the outcome of the report. Second thing, again, it's not in England and Wales, but in Scotland, there's been a big review of raptor persecution and grouse moor management under the term the Werity Review. And Scotland are going to bring in licensing to driven grouse moors. Now, that is a key thing for the RSPB. The RSPB believes that if all grouse moors are licensed, the ones that are not killing wildlife would have nothing to fear. The ones that are killing wildlife, if they then got caught, they would lose the ability to shoot. And we believe that this would really focus the minds. Many commentators are calling for a complete ban on driven grouse moors. The RSPB are not doing that currently, but we have a policy in place. And if this situation does not change, we will get tougher. Final thing in terms of the successes, we've really noticed a big increase, particularly in England and Wales, where we've been working with enforcement agencies over the past 9 months or so. I'm aware of at least 15 raids on locations where birds of prey have been illegally killed on estates. And many of those cases are progressing now towards prosecution. We're working hand in glove with the police and the CPS, the National Wildlife Crime Unit, Natural England, CCW in Wales. That's a real change, and we absolutely welcome that. Finally, RSPB wrote a guide for the police and the enforcement agencies this year in how to tackle and investigate raptor persecution. We've distributed that to every police wildlife crime officer. I think that's about 600 officers. And it's a very detailed book, and it's got lots of information in there on exactly how you tackle raptor persecution. So the final point for me, again, is the recommendation. We need to see driven grouse moors. We're in a nature and climate emergency, and our mission cannot wait. We have to act upon this now. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. So we now move to our final panelist, Jenny Hawley from Plantlife International. Over to you, Jenny, and let's hope for the last time that the slides work. I think we might be getting there now.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And hello, everyone. Thanks for the session today. It's been really interesting to hear the other presentations. And I just wanted to just a couple of minutes talking about plant and fungi crime. So if you can move on to the next slide, Matt. So this plants and fungi obviously tend to fly under the radar a little bit in terms of wildlife crime in England and Wales. Plants and fungi, we find very often in plant life, they tend to be seen as this kind of green and brown backdrop to other species. And obviously we don't have the kind of animal welfare concerns here as with the other cases that we've heard about today. But it's not to say that there's not a problem. Unfortunately, because of the system at the moment, we don't have data on domestic crime against plants and fungi because that's not recorded and collected. But we do know there's a very large-scale illegal international trade in plants and derivatives, so including timber, live orchids, medicinal plants, and other plants and derivatives. And even for the UK, that makes up about half of all the CITES seizures by the UK Border Force, so under the international convention there. And there's different types of plants and fungi crime. They can be more difficult to investigate because there's no kind of smoking trail when when something's been stolen or damaged. And there can be questions about natural kind of digging up by badgers and other creatures of flower bulbs and so on. So I think these cases can be more difficult to spot. They're less visible, but they do have this impact, as Luke said, on the ecological crisis, and not just on those species affected, but the wider habitat. So historically, we've had a lot more of the sort of targeting of very rare and threatened species. So particular orchids have been very much in demand by specialist collectors. So there's live plants being kind of dug up from the wild, and that has driven several species to the brink of extinction. But I think what we're seeing more recently is a large-scale collection of more common species from the wild. So that could be mushrooms to be supplied into restaurants. Has become quite a trendy thing to have kind of woodland fungi on the menu. And also wildflower bulbs such as bluebells and snowdrops, which are meant for commercial trade. And that was a huge problem a couple of decades ago, particularly for bluebells, which Plantlife led a big campaign on, and we managed to get that species scheduled on Schedule 8 so that it had the legal protection. And that did help to reduce numbers, but we do still see instances of this. And I just want to highlight recent cases that we've documented in the report in Norfolk, both in Norfolk, so one of snowdrops and one of bluebells. Matt, can you go to the next slide, please? I've just got a couple of images which were supplied by Norfolk Police. So they found a number of individuals who were basically stripping this woodland of its bluebells into large sacks. And they counted about 8,000 individual plants that have been uprooted or have been taken away for trade. And again, we think of bluebells as such an iconic species in our countryside, and obviously these fantastic bluebell woods that we have, and to strip those out, even though they're still a common species, not only damages that species, but also the whole woodland or the habitat that they're growing in. So we need to think about that broader kind of ecological damage as well, and to just understand and to strengthen the system, which allows the police to investigate and to prosecute and to have stronger sentencing guidelines for those types of crimes. And I think, to come back to one of the points that Luke made at the beginning about the enjoyment and the connection with nature, and we at Plantlife feel very much, picking the odd wildflower is very much part of the enjoyment of nature and being connected to it. We don't want to discourage people from that, but it is about understanding, what you're picking and where, and the species, and making sure that that there's a great abundance of those flowers or plants if you are going to pick one or two for your own purposes. So there is quite strong legislation protecting these plants, but that legislation needs to be enforced. So we would support the recommendations of the report, and I'll hand back to Matt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that picture of the bluebell wood strip there is a very good illustration of a lot of the wildlife crime points that we're making, that wildlife crime deprives us of the beauty that we should all hold in common from nature. Now, I know we're running on a little bit, so what I suggest is a slight change to the running order. So I'm keen to just answer get 2 questions in if we can, and then I'll come to Martin Sims to conclude with our recommendations as a final. What can we all do to stop wildlife crime? So we've had quite a few questions in which illustrate, the real distaste for what's happening with hunting and countryside. We also have a question about education, which is linked to one that we had in before the event began, actually, from Hannah Malpass. And I think this might be one for the Badger Trust and perhaps Craig at the Badger Trust. about how can we educate developers and all those in business not to commit wildlife crime accidentally, because obviously that can happen sometimes. What can be done to try and prevent badger sets, but also bat roosts being destroyed by accident? Over to you, Dawn and Craig.
Okay, I'm happy to answer that, Matt. So it's for those, it's Craig Fellows from the Badger Trust. With regards to development itself, so I sit on the UK Badger Priority Persecution Group, and we are looking at the issues around development and wish to work with the development industry, the construction industry, the Association of Local Government Ecologists, and seeing how we can get better education, I think is down to it. Better informed, so that the all aspects are being covered. So we need to educate. We need to be working with those organisations involved that are potentially maybe going to come across some of the issues themselves and may well find themselves being investigated. So closely working with them, closer education, and offering training. Again, we've done training with the police, so why not do training for the relevant industries involved?
Thank you very much, Craig. And we have one final question which has just come in, which is for Mark Thomas of RSPB. You're calling RSPB for licensing of grouse moors. What can be done to tackle raptor persecution on lowland shoots? Good question.
Okay, so the key thing here about licensing is the Scottish Government are going to bring this in, and we will all be able to sit back and watch the impact of that and to see whether it brings about what we need. In terms of lowland, the density of persecution in the uplands is very dense in a few places. In the lowlands, it's extremely widespread, but not in great density. So what we welcome here is the public being the eyes and ears for us, and the public can report where those crimes are. As I said before, there's about 15 investigations ongoing at the moment, and the vast majority of those are actually in the lowlands, and the vast majority have come from the lockdown period when the public went out in greater numbers than ever before, saw these things happening and reported it to the police. So I think once those cases reach court next year, and there'll be a lot of publicity around it, because some of the things that we filmed are really gruesome. And I think once that publicity hits home, people will see it. That will probably lead to more reports coming in, but ultimately it will send a deterrent message out to the people that are committing these crimes. The second point of that in the lowlands, a big issue here is the release of non-native game birds. I think it's 64 million pheasants being released, and we're doing lots of science at the moment, RSPB, to look at the impact that has on native wildlife, because lots of native wildlife, particularly in woodlands, is declining as a result of that. So I think it's a package where it's investigation, it's prosecution in cases where the evidence is good enough, and it's also scientific research to show exactly what is going on in terms of the ecosystems in the lowlands.
Thank you very much. And before moving to Martin, just to draw attention to two quite a lot of helpful comments, useful ones from the NFU, pointing out the impact of people, the impact that wildlife crime has on people, particularly hare coursing, which can be associated with farm thefts. And also just to flag Rachel's question about education packages. Some of that, there's links to that in the wildlife crime report itself and to Naturewatch's work there and the Badger Trust, but I'm sure as well Kate can follow that up in the chat or elsewhere. So with 1 minute to go, and sorry we're slightly overrunning, I think we'll conclude by turning to Martin. Martin, in 1 minute, after all of your years combating wildlife crime, what are the 3 things that we can implement now to try and tackle this once and for all?
3 things. Thanks for putting me on the spot like that. There's 6, actually, Matt. Making wildlife crimes notifiable, for one. It's bonkers that here we are in the 21st century and we can't even at the push of a button in policing say how many crimes there are. And that links to the training of both call handlers and the police is effective and implemented so that investigations are conducted soundly, so that we have consistency, because we don't have that. Early CPS advice into criminal wildlife crime investigations is essential. It's on offer from the CPS, but so many times across the board, whether it was Mark Gordon with BCT, Mark in RSPB, Craig Badger Trust, we see that there is no early investigative advice and it falls down. Delivering consistency of prosecutions within the CPS. We're making some strides through Link, that the training has been accepted and it starts next month, so that's great. Producing sentencing guidelines for wildlife crime is essential. They're not out there, so there's inconsistency in the way sanctions are delivered or not delivered. And we wait with bated breath in relation to the fact that a number of us were interviewed as part of the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime recommendations. That we hope that this report, we know it's with DEFRA, announced that it will accept all the recommendations on there to move forward. And if it does, then I'd like to think we'll get some real push in consistency now that we have a new National Police Chiefs Council lead in Deputy Chief Constable Debbie Ford, in really grabbing the bull by the horns and taking this forward to investigate crime, wildlife crime, much more effectively and prevent it. There you go, Matt.
Very concise. Thank you very much, Martin. And thank you to Luke and to all our panelists and for all of you who have come along and listened and asked questions. Do keep an eye on Link's Wildlife Crime Report work and wider wildlife crime work. As Luke said, we are going to carry on. So keep an eye on the Link website. And as quite a few people have commented, reports from members of the public do make a difference in terms of tackling wildlife crime. So everyone can play their part. Thank you very much, everyone.
Matt, can I just say, as chair of the group, I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions to it. It's fantastic that I get such support from across the board. I get January and February off before I start worrying about the next crime report, because it's like the fourth bridge. I start painting it in March and it all builds up to November and December. So I'd just like to thank everyone for their support. It's terrific, and thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, good to see everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. Goodbye, everyone. Bye-bye.